Step out of the vehicle. Now. The command cut through the cold midnight air like it had been said 1,000 times before, sharp, practiced, unquestioned, and under the harsh white glare of checkpoint floodlights. Naomi Carter slowly opened her door, the quiet click echoing louder than it should have as engines idled in a long line stretching nearly a quarter-mile behind her, drivers watching through windshields, waiting, judging, while Officer Daniel Brooks stood squared in front of her car, hand resting near his belt, eyes scanning not just her license plate but her face, her skin, the way she moved, as if he had already decided what she was before she even spoke. And for a brief second, just one, Naomi didn't move, her fingers still resting on the steering wheel, her breath steady, controlled, the kind of stillness you don't learn in ordinary places, the kind that comes from rooms where decisions carry weight far beyond a roadside stop. But then she stepped out, calm, composed, the faint crunch of gravel under her boots grounding her in the moment as the wind brushed past, carrying the low murmur of radios and distant traffic, and Brooks circled slightly, flashlight lifting, its beam pausing on her face longer than necessary before dropping to her hands. License and registration, he said, his tone flat, but edged with something colder, something quieter, something that didn't need to be loud to be felt. And Naomi reached slowly, deliberately, every movement precise, handing over her documents. Without a word, her eyes meeting his just once, steady, unreadable, before he looked away with a faint scoff, as if that calm unsettled him more than defiance ever could, and around them the checkpoint hummed with tension, orange cones lining the road, temporary barriers casting long shadows across the asphalt, another officer watching from a distance, saying nothing, doing nothing, just observing, as Brooks glanced down at the license, then back at her, then back again, stretching the silence. Longer than necessary. Where are you headed this late? He asked, though it sounded less like a question and more like a test, and Naomi answered simply, passing through, her voice even, controlled, giving nothing more than required. But something in that answer seemed to irritate him, the lack of explanation, the absence of apology, and he stepped closer, just enough to shift the balance of space. Step to the front of the vehicle, he said, firmer now, and she complied without hesitation, placing her hands lightly on the hood, the metal cool beneath her palms as the light overhead flickered slightly. A small detail, easy to miss, but her eyes caught it, registered it, stored it, because that's what she did. That's what she had always done. Even now, even here, as Brooks moved behind her, radio crackling softly at his shoulder, the sound distorting for a brief second before clearing, and somewhere in the distance, just beyond the line of cars, headlights shifted, a vehicle repositioning in the dark, unnoticed by most, but not by her, never by her, and as the seconds stretched, the air thickened with something unspoken, something waiting, because this wasn't just a stop, and deep down, whether he realized it or not, neither was he. The metal of the hood held the night cold beneath Naomi Carter's palms, steady and unyielding, while the wind shifted across the checkpoint, carrying the faint hum of engines and the low murmur of distant radios, and behind her, Officer Daniel Brooks exhaled slowly, as if settling into control, the kind of quiet confidence that comes from believing nothing here could challenge him, nothing here could surprise him. And he began his routine, circling her vehicle again, slower this time, flashlight beam tracing along the edges, pausing at the trunk, the rear window, the tires, stretching each second into something heavier than it needed to be, as though the act itself was less about inspection and more about assertion. And Naomi remained still, her posture relaxed but precise, every breath measured, her gaze forward, not defiant, not submissive, just present. And somewhere to the left another officer shifted his weight, watching but not intervening, the unspoken agreement hanging in the air that this was Brooks's stop, his call, his moment, and the radio on his shoulder crackled again, a burst of static, followed by a clipped voice that cut in and out too quickly to fully understand, and Brooks tapped it once, dismissing it without listening, his attention fixed entirely on her. You said you were just passing through, he repeated, slower now, as if testing the words themselves, and Naomi answered the same way she had before. Yes, calm, even, unchanged, and that sameness seemed to irritate him more than anything else. The lack of explanation, the absence of nervousness, because people in this situation were supposed to react, to fill the silence, to justify themselves, but she did not, and for a brief moment, just a flicker, his eyes narrowed as if trying to place something he could not quite name, something about the way she stood, the way she did not shift under pressure, the way her stillness felt less like compliance and more like control, and he turned away from her again, glancing down at the license in his hand, reading the name once more, Naomi Carter, letting it sit there, as if it should mean something, as if it almost did, but he shook it off, folding it back with a small, dismissive motion before stepping closer again, the gravel crunching under his boots. "Pop the trunk," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for discussion, and Naomi did not hesitate, did not argue. She simply reached into her pocket slowly, pressing the release on her key fob, and a soft click sounded from the rear of the car, followed by the faint lift of the trunk opening into the night, and Brooks walked toward it immediately, his pace quickening just slightly, like he expected to find something, like he needed to find something. And as he leaned in, the light from his flashlight spilling across the empty interior, something shifted again, subtle but real, the air tightening. The distant vehicle that had repositioned earlier now sitting still with its headlights dimmed, almost invisible, and Naomi's eyes moved just once, barely noticeable, tracking that presence for a fraction of a second before returning forward, her expression unchanged, because she already knew what was coming next, even if he did not. And behind them the radio crackled again, louder this time, a voice pushing through the static with urgency. "Unit 7, confirm identification immediately." And Brooks paused, just for a second, the smallest hesitation, before reaching for his radio, unaware that the moment he had been controlling was already beginning to shift beyond his grasp. The radio in Daniel Brooks's hand hissed again, louder now, the static cutting sharper through the cold air as the voice pushed through with urgency that no longer sounded routine. "Unit 7, confirm identification immediately." And for the first time since the stop began, something in his posture shifted, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to break the rhythm he had been controlling, and he pressed the button, his tone clipped, controlled, standby, as if buying time, as if he needed just one more second to reassert the situation, to bring it back under his command. And he turned from the open trunk, stepping back toward Naomi Carter, his eyes narrowing slightly, studying her again, this time with a hint of something else beneath the authority, something quieter, something closer to doubt. But he pushed it down quickly, replacing it with the same hardened expression he had worn from the start, because uncertainty had no place here, not for him, not in front of the line of drivers watching, not in front of the other officers who had begun to pay closer attention, their conversations fading as the tension thickened, and Naomi remained exactly where she had been, hands resting lightly on the hood, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, the stillness around her almost deliberate, almost intentional, as though she had stepped outside the moment while everyone else was still caught inside it. And Brooks stopped just a few feet away from her, holding her license again, glancing at it once more, then back at her, then down at the radio in his hand as it crackled again, the same voice repeating, sharper now. "Unit 7, confirm identification immediately." And this time it was not just a request, it was an order, and the air seemed to tighten around them, the distant engines idling louder in the silence, the faint flicker of the overhead light casting shifting shadows across the asphalt, and Brooks hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before lifting the radio again, his voice slightly lower, running now. But he did not move to do it, not yet. Instead, he took one more step closer to Naomi, as if proximity might give him the answer he was looking for, as if standing closer would somehow restore the certainty he felt slipping, and he spoke again, slower this time. "You got anything you want to tell me before this goes further?" And there it was, the subtle shift from command to question, from control to something else, something less certain. And Naomi finally moved, just enough to turn her head slightly, not fully, just enough for her voice to carry back to him without raising it, calm, even, unshaken. "You are already further than you think." And the words did not sound like a warning, they did not sound like a threat, they sounded like a fact, simple and direct. And for a brief moment the world around them seemed to pause, the radios, the engines, even the wind, all falling into a strange, suspended silence. And then from the darkness beyond the checkpoint, a low, steady rumble began to rise, not loud, not sudden, but unmistakable, the sound of multiple engines approaching in perfect coordination, and one of the officers further down the line turned his head, squinting into the distance, his posture shifting from passive observation to alert attention. And Brooks followed that movement instinctively, glancing past Naomi, toward the road behind her, where a set of headlights began to emerge, then another, forming a line that moved with purpose, not slowing, not hesitating, and something inside him tightened, a realization not yet fully formed but impossible to ignore. And as the first vehicle drew closer, its lights cutting clean through the darkness, Naomi's expression did not change, not even slightly, because whatever was coming, she had been expecting it all along. The approaching engines grew louder, not chaotic but controlled, synchronized in a way that did not belong to ordinary traffic. And as the first black SUV rolled into the edge of the checkpoint lights, its headlights cut clean across the scene, washing over Officer Daniel Brooks and the line of cars behind him, forcing several drivers to shield their eyes while the other officers instinctively straightened, their attention shifting without a word, because something about the formation, the precision, the timing felt different. And Brooks stood still for a moment, his radio still in his hand, the static now drowned beneath the low, steady hum of those vehicles closing the distance. And Naomi Carter remained exactly where she was, her hands still resting on the hood, her posture unchanged, her calm now standing in stark contrast to the subtle unease spreading through the checkpoint. And the lead SUV did not slow until it reached the barrier, stopping just short before the engine idled into a quiet, controlled purr, followed immediately by the others lining up behind it, forming a presence that could not be ignored. And one of the officers near the cones took a hesitant step forward, as if unsure whether to intervene or step aside. But before he could decide, the driver's side door of the lead vehicle opened with deliberate precision, and a man stepped out, tall, composed, his presence alone enough to shift the atmosphere without a single raised voice, his gaze sweeping the scene once, taking in Brooks, the open trunk, Naomi at the front of her vehicle, and the line of onlookers behind. And when he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried with unmistakable authority. "Who is in charge here?" And the question hung in the air for less than a second before every eye turned to Brooks, because moments ago there had been no doubt, no hesitation, but now that certainty felt thinner, less solid, and Brooks stepped forward, his posture tightening, reclaiming what control he could. "I am," he said, his tone firm, though just beneath it there was something else now, something quieter, something uncertain, and the man's gaze settled on him, steady, evaluating, before shifting briefly toward Naomi, then back again. "Then you are going to release her," he said, calm, direct, not a request, not a suggestion, and the simplicity of it cut deeper than any raised voice could have. And Brooks blinked once, the words not quite landing the way he expected, because nothing in this situation followed the script he had been relying on, and he gestured slightly toward Naomi. "She has not been cleared yet," he replied, holding on to procedure, onto protocol, the last structure he could stand on. But the man did not react, did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply reached into his jacket and held up a badge, letting it catch the light just enough, and said, "You are delaying a classified operation." And for the first time since the stop began, the silence that followed was not controlled by Brooks. It was controlled by something far beyond him, something that had already moved into place long before he realized he was standing in its path. And behind him, the radio crackled again, louder, clearer now, repeating the same command with urgency that could no longer be ignored. "Unit 7, confirm identification immediately." And Brooks's grip tightened slightly around the device as the realization began to settle, slow and heavy, because this was no longer about a routine stop, no longer about suspicion or control. And Naomi finally lifted her hands from the hood, not abruptly, not defensively, just calmly, as if the moment had reached its natural end. And when she turned to face him fully, her expression remained composed, steady, but her eyes held something different now, something undeniable. And in that moment, before anyone said another word, before any explanation was Given, Brooks understood one thing with absolute clarity. He had not been in control of this situation, not even for a second. The silence after the words settled felt heavier than anything that had come before, stretching across the checkpoint like a pressure no one could ignore, and Officer Daniel Brooks stood there with the radio still in his hand, the static now sharp and constant, demanding a response he had already delayed too long. But his focus was no longer on the device. It was on Naomi Carter, on the way she had turned to face him, on the way her composure had not changed even as everything around them had shifted, and for a brief moment, he tried to hold on to the version of the situation he understood, the version where he was in control, where procedures dictated outcomes. But that version was slipping piece by piece, with every second that passed, and behind him, one of the other officers took a small step back, subtle but telling, creating distance without being told, while another lowered his gaze entirely, choosing not to engage, because the presence of those vehicles, of that man who had stepped out with quiet authority, had already redrawn the boundaries of the moment, and Brooks swallowed once, barely noticeable, before finally lifting the radio closer, pressing the button with a steadiness that took more effort than he expected. Unit 7 confirming identification, he said, his voice controlled but lacking the certainty it had carried before, and the response came immediately this time. Clear, direct, leaving no space for interpretation. Confirmed. Stand down and release immediately. And the words landed with finality, not force, not volume, just clarity, and Brooks lowered the radio slowly, the weight of it now unfamiliar in his hand, as if it belonged to a different situation entirely. And Naomi did not move toward him, did not step back. She simply stood there, waiting, her presence now undeniable in a way that had nothing to do with volume or resistance. And Brooks looked at her again, really looked this time, past the surface, past the assumptions he had made within seconds of seeing her. And there it was, the detail he had missed, not something obvious, not something loud, but something precise, the posture, the stillness, the awareness, the kind that did not come from chance, the kind that came from experience he could not measure. And he exhaled slowly, the air leaving his chest heavier than it should have, before stepping forward. His movements no longer sharp or commanding, but careful, deliberate, and he reached for the restraints he had placed moments earlier, unlocking them without a word, the small metallic sound carrying in the silence. And when her hands were free, Naomi lowered them calmly, not rubbing her wrists, not reacting, just letting them fall naturally to her sides, as if the interruption had been nothing more than a delay. And Brooks took a half step back, creating space this time, not asserting it. And the man from the SUV watched the exchange without comment, his expression unchanged, his presence steady, ensuring the moment completed itself without interference. And for a few seconds, no one spoke, the checkpoint frozen in a quiet that felt different now, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but resolved. And Naomi reached for her keys, the soft electronic click echoing as her trunk closed behind her, and she turned slightly toward Brooks, her voice calm, measured. "Next time," she said, not raising it, not hardening it, just stating it. "Verify before you assume." And there was no anger in it, no accusation, just truth, simple and direct. And Brooks nodded once, a small movement, almost automatic, because there was nothing else to do, nothing else to say. And as she stepped back toward her vehicle, the line of cars remained still, the other officers silent, and the man by the SUV turned slightly, signaling without words that the moment was over, that whatever had been interrupted was now ready to continue. And as Naomi opened her door and paused for just a second, her eyes moved briefly toward the dark road ahead, where the mission she had been part of was already moving again, already unfolding. And then she stepped inside, closing the door with quiet precision, leaving behind a checkpoint that would never feel quite the same again. The engine of Naomi Carter's car started with a low, controlled hum, blending into the steady rhythm of the checkpoint as if nothing unusual had happened. But the atmosphere had already changed, subtle yet undeniable, like a line had been crossed that could not be redrawn. And as her headlights cut forward onto the road, the vehicles behind her remained still for just a moment longer than necessary. The drivers inside watching, processing, trying to understand what they had just witnessed, without fully grasping it. and Officer Daniel Brooks stood a few feet back from where he had been moments ago, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but held in a quiet stillness that felt unfamiliar, his eyes fixed on the rear of Naomi's car as it rolled forward slowly, merging into the open lane beyond the checkpoint. And for a brief second, he considered saying something, anything, but the words never formed, because whatever could have been said had already been rendered meaningless by what had just unfolded. And behind him, the man from the SUV stepped slightly to the side, allowing the path ahead to clear, his presence still commanding without effort, while the other officers began to move again, but not with the same energy as before, their actions slower, more deliberate, as if recalibrating to a reality that no longer fit the assumptions they had been operating under. And the radio on Brooks's shoulder crackled once more, quieter now, almost routine again, but he did not reach for it immediately, his focus still lingering on the road ahead, where Naomi's vehicle was now just another set of taillights disappearing into the darkness, blending with the distant traffic, indistinguishable to anyone who had not been here, who had not seen the moment for what it was. And he exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than expected, before finally lifting the radio, his voice steady but lower. Unit 7 returning to normal operations. And the response came back with a simple acknowledgement, no questions, no follow-up, as if the system itself had already moved on, already adjusted, leaving him alone with the weight of what remained. And he lowered the radio again, glancing down briefly at his hands. At the same hands that had moments ago acted without hesitation, without doubt, and now felt different, not because they had changed, but because his understanding of what they represented had shifted, and one of the officers nearby approached cautiously, stopping just short of him. "You good?" he asked, his tone neutral but carrying a hint of something unspoken, and Brooks nodded once, a small, automatic motion. "Yeah," he replied, though the word felt incomplete even as he said it. And the officer hesitated for a second before stepping back, leaving him alone again in the space that no longer felt like his to control. And as the checkpoint resumed its rhythm, cars moving forward, cones guiding the flow, lights casting long shadows across the asphalt, Brooks remained where he was for just a moment longer, his gaze drifting once more to the road ahead, where everything looked the same as before, but nothing felt the same at all, because somewhere out there, beyond the reach of this checkpoint, beyond the limits of what he could see or influence, Naomi Carter was already back in motion, already part of something larger, something he had interrupted without understanding. And the realization settled quietly, not as a shock, not as a sudden impact, but as a slow, undeniable truth, that control, the kind he believed in, the kind he relied on, had never really been his to begin with. The checkpoint lights continued to hum overhead, casting the same pale glow across the asphalt, the same shadows stretching long and thin across the cones and barriers. But for Officer Daniel Brooks, nothing about the scene felt routine anymore, not after what had just happened, not after the quiet authority that had stepped in and rewritten the moment without force, without argument, just presence alone. And as the next car rolled forward, a gray sedan inching toward his position, he forced himself to move, to step back into the role he had been trained for, the one that had always felt automatic, but now required effort, conscious effort, as if each motion had to be recalculated before it could be carried out. And he raised his hand slightly, signaling the driver to stop, his voice steady but lacking the edge it once carried. "Good evening," he said, the words familiar, practiced, but different now in ways he could not fully explain, and the driver nodded, handing over documents. Without hesitation, without tension, just another routine exchange. But Brooks noticed something he had not paid attention to before, the way the driver's eyes searched his face for a brief second, measuring, cautious, as if expecting something more than a simple request. And he took the documents, glancing at them quickly before handing them back. "You are good to go," he said, stepping aside immediately, not prolonging the moment, not stretching it beyond what was necessary, and the car moved on, merging into the darkness ahead, just like the others. But the difference was not in them. It was in him, in the way the interaction had shifted, subtle but real. And behind him, the other officers had resumed their positions, their movements quieter now, less assertive, as if the entire checkpoint had adjusted to an unspoken understanding, and Brooks reached up, adjusting his radio slightly, more out of habit than necessity, before letting his hand fall back to his side, and his gaze drifted again toward the road ahead, where Naomi Carter had disappeared minutes earlier, her presence now reduced to memory, but not fading. Not yet, because what she had left behind was not something that could be dismissed or ignored. It lingered, not as tension, not as conflict, but as awareness, a shift in perspective that had taken root in a matter of minutes. And he thought back to the moment she had looked at him, not with anger, not with fear, but with something else, something steadier, something that had made his authority feel smaller without ever challenging it directly. And that realization settled deeper now, not as a sudden realization, but as a slow unfolding truth. And another car approached, this time a pickup truck, its headlights cutting across the cones as it rolled to a stop, and Brooks stepped forward again, repeating the same motion, the same words, but with a different weight behind them, a different awareness guiding them. And as the checkpoint continued, car after car, document after document, the rhythm returned, but it was no longer the same rhythm he had known before, because somewhere between one stop and the next, between one assumption and the next, something had shifted, something quiet but lasting. And as the night stretched on, the road ahead remained unchanged to anyone passing through. Just another checkpoint, just another delay, but for the man standing at its center, the one who had believed he understood the boundaries of control. The lines between authority and assumption had begun to blur, and once that line is seen, once it is felt, it does not simply disappear, it stays, reshaping every moment that follows, long after the lights fade and the road returns to silence. The night stretched deeper past midnight, the air growing colder as the steady flow of vehicles continued through the checkpoint, headlights appearing and disappearing in a rhythm that now felt almost mechanical, predictable to everyone except Officer Daniel Brooks, who stood at his post with a focus that had changed in ways even he did not fully understand. And each car that approached no longer looked the same as before, no longer blurred into a single pattern of routine stops and quick decisions. Instead, each one carried a pause, a moment of observation that lingered just a second longer than necessary, as if he was searching for something beneath the surface, something he had overlooked too easily before. And as a dark blue sedan rolled forward, slowing to a stop in front of him, Brooks raised his hand again, signaling the driver with a calm gesture, his voice steady but measured. "Good evening." And the driver, a middle-aged man, nodded and handed over his license, his movements cautious but not fearful, simply aware, and Brooks took it, glancing down briefly before looking back up. But this time his eyes did not immediately scan for suspicion. They paused, taking in the person in front of him as a whole rather than a fragment, and he realized how unfamiliar that felt, how different it was from the instinct he had relied on for years, the instinct that categorized, that assumed, that decided before confirming. And for a brief moment, the memory of Naomi Carter returned, not as a sharp interruption, but as a quiet presence, the stillness in her posture, the certainty in her voice, the way she had not reacted because she had not needed to. And Brooks exhaled slowly, grounding himself in the present before handing the license back. "You are good to go," he said, stepping aside. And as the sedan moved on, he caught a glimpse of the driver's expression in the passing light, a subtle nod, a small acknowledgement, and it stayed with him longer than expected. And behind him, the other officers continued their duties, but the energy among them had shifted as well, conversations quieter, movements more deliberate, as if the entire checkpoint had absorbed the lesson of what had happened without anyone needing to say it out loud. And one of the younger officers approached Brooks again, this time with less hesitation, standing beside him for a moment as another car approached in the distance. "That earlier situation," he began, then paused, choosing his words carefully. "You handled it." But he did not finish the sentence, because there was no simple way to define what had been handled, what had been changed, and Brooks nodded once, his eyes still on the road. "Yeah," he replied quietly, though the word carried more weight now, more reflection than certainty, and the officer stepped back, leaving him again with the steady rhythm of the checkpoint. And as the next vehicle rolled forward, Brooks adjusted his stance slightly, not to assert control, but to align himself with something steadier, something more aware, and the night continued, the lights humming, the road stretching out into darkness, but beneath the surface of that routine, something had taken root, something that would not fade with the passing hours. Because once a moment reveals the gap between what you believe and what is true, it does not simply close again. It stays open, shaping every decision that follows. And as Brooks raised his hand once more to signal the next driver, his movements carried that awareness forward, subtle, unseen by anyone passing through, but undeniable to him. A quiet shift that marked the difference between control and understanding, between assumption and truth. And somewhere far ahead on that same road, Naomi Carter was already beyond reach, already back in motion. But the impact of her presence remained, not as conflict, not as memory alone, but as a change that would continue long after the checkpoint lights dimmed and the road returned to silence. The hours moved quietly toward early morning, the sky still dark but beginning to lose its depth, a faint hint of gray settling at the horizon as the checkpoint continued its steady rhythm. And Officer Daniel Brooks stood with a presence that now felt different from the one he had carried earlier that night. Not weaker, not uncertain, but more aware, more deliberate, as if each moment required attention rather than assumption. And as another vehicle approached, its headlights dimmed as it slowed into position, Brooks raised his hand, signaling the stop with a calm motion that no longer demanded control but guided it. And the driver rolled down the window, offering a brief nod. A simple exchange that once would have passed without thought, but now held a quiet weight. And Brooks leaned slightly, not invading space, not asserting dominance. Just present. "Good morning," he said, his tone even, grounded, and the driver handed over a license, the small card reflecting the overhead light for a second before settling in his hand. And as he looked down, his eyes moved across the details. But this time he did not rush, did not skim for confirmation of what he already believed. Instead, he paused, letting the information speak before forming a conclusion. And the moment stretched, not uncomfortably, but intentionally, as if time itself had slowed to match the shift in his approach. And when he handed the license back, he met the driver's eyes briefly, not searching, not judging, just acknowledging. "You are good to go," he said, stepping aside. And as the vehicle moved forward, its taillights fading into the distance, Brooks felt the difference settle in again, subtle but steady, like a recalibration that had taken hold without resistance. And behind him, one of the senior officers walked past, glancing at him for a second, longer than usual, as if noticing the change but choosing not to question it, because some things did not need to be spoken to be understood. And the checkpoint continued, car after car, interaction after interaction, each one reinforcing the shift, building it into something consistent, something lasting. And for Brooks, the memory of Naomi Carter was no longer just a moment from earlier in the night. It had become a reference point, a quiet marker of where one way of thinking ended and another began. And he found himself returning to it without effort, not replaying the tension or the interruption, but the stillness, the control she had carried without needing to prove it, the certainty that had not depended on his recognition to exist. And that realization stayed with him as the next car approached, a white SUV slowing into place, its headlights illuminating the edge of the barrier. And Brooks stepped forward again, repeating the same motion, the same words, but with a clarity that had not been there before. And as the driver handed over documents, there was no rush, no assumption, just a process grounded in attention rather than expectation. And as the sky above slowly lightened, the first faint indication of dawn beginning to appear, the checkpoint remained in motion, unchanged to anyone passing through. Just another stop on the road, just another brief delay, but for the man standing at its center, the one who had once believed that control came from certainty, from quick decisions and firm commands, something had shifted into place that could not be undone, something quieter, something stronger. An understanding that control without awareness was incomplete, and that awareness, once gained, reshaped everything that followed, not in dramatic ways, not in visible ones, but in the small, consistent choices made moment by moment. And as Brooks raised his hand once more to signal the next driver, the gesture carried that understanding forward, subtle, steady, and lasting, marking the difference between the man he had been at the start of the night and the one who now stood beneath the fading lights, watching the road not just for movement, but for truth. The first light of dawn began to stretch across the horizon, soft and pale, gradually replacing the artificial glow of the checkpoint lamps that had dominated the night. And as the sky shifted from deep gray to a faint blue, Officer Daniel Brooks found himself standing in a moment that felt both familiar and entirely new. The same road, the same cones, the same steady line of vehicles approaching and passing through. Yet everything carried a different weight now, a quiet clarity that had settled in over the past few hours. And as another car rolled forward, slowing to a stop in front of him, he raised his hand with a calm, measured motion, no longer sharp or commanding, but steady, grounded, and the driver lowered the window, offering a polite nod. "Morning," Brooks replied, his voice even, the word carrying a tone that felt less like routine and more like intention. And as he received the license, his eyes moved across it with focus, not searching for confirmation of suspicion, but simply reading, allowing the information to exist without forcing it into a conclusion. And for a brief moment, the silence between them was not tense, not uncertain, just present, and Brooks realized how different that felt, how much of his past interactions had been filled with assumptions he never questioned. And as he handed the license back, he met the driver's eyes with a brief acknowledgement. "You are good to go," stepping aside with a motion that felt natural, unforced, and the car moved on, its tires rolling smoothly over the asphalt as it merged into the open road ahead. And behind him, the checkpoint continued to operate. But the energy had shifted fully now, no longer carrying the edge of control that had defined it earlier in the night, instead replaced by something quieter, something steadier, as if the entire space had adjusted to a new rhythm. And one of the officers approached Brooks again, this time without hesitation, standing beside him for a moment as they watched the next vehicle approach. "Long night," he said, a simple observation, and Brooks nodded slightly. "Yeah," he replied. But this time the word held a different meaning, not just fatigue, but reflection. And the officer glanced at him briefly before looking back at the road. "That situation earlier," he began, then paused, choosing not to finish, because the details did not need to be spoken, the impact already understood, and Brooks did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the approaching headlights. The memory of Naomi Carter still present, not as tension, not as conflict, but as a turning point. A quiet shift that had changed something fundamental in how he saw the role he carried. And as the next car pulled up, he stepped forward again, repeating the same motion, the same process, but with a consistency that now felt intentional, each action grounded in awareness rather than habit. And the sky continued to brighten, the natural light slowly overtaking the artificial, revealing the checkpoint in a different way, softer, clearer, less defined by shadows. And Brooks found himself noticing details he had overlooked before, the way drivers held their steering wheels, the way their expressions shifted when they approached, the subtle tension that eased when they were waved through, and it stayed with him. Each small observation building into something larger, something that extended beyond this road, beyond this moment. And as the line of cars began to thin, the early morning traffic replacing the steady flow of the night, Brooks stepped back slightly, his posture relaxed but attentive, and he looked down the road once more, the same stretch of pavement that had carried Naomi Carter away hours earlier, now quiet, empty, yet still holding the weight of what had happened. And he understood something clearly now, something that did not need explanation, that control was not about holding power over a moment, but about understanding the moment itself. And as he raised his hand one more time to guide the next vehicle forward, the gesture carried that understanding with it, subtle, steady, and lasting, marking the difference between reacting to what he thought he saw and responding to what was truly there. The morning had fully arrived now, the sky washed in soft blue with streaks of gold stretching above the open road, and the checkpoint that once felt isolated in darkness now stood exposed in daylight. Every cone, every barrier, every movement visible in a way that left no room for shadows. And Officer Daniel Brooks stood at his post with a quiet stillness that no longer came from habit, but from awareness, the kind that settles in after a moment changes you without asking for permission. And as the final wave of early commuters passed through, the line of vehicles thinning into scattered intervals. He found himself no longer rushing to fill the silence between stops, no longer needing to assert presence through motion or tone, instead allowing each interaction to exist as it was, simple, direct, grounded in what was in front of him rather than what he expected to find. And as a small sedan rolled to a stop, its engine humming softly, Brooks stepped forward, his voice calm. "Good morning." And the driver, a young woman, offered a brief smile, handing over her license without hesitation, and Brooks took it, his eyes moving across the details with the same steady attention he had carried through the last few hours. But now there was something else beneath it, something quieter, something that recognized the weight of each decision, no matter how small it seemed. And as he handed the license back, he paused for just a fraction of a second, not out of doubt, but out of intention, before stepping aside. "You are all set," he said, and the car moved forward, merging into the growing light of the day, and behind him, the other officers had begun to relax, their posture easing as the shift neared its end, conversations returning in low tones. The tension of the night fully dissolved into the routine of the morning, but Brooks remained where he was, not out of obligation, but because something inside him had not yet settled, not fully, and as he looked out over the road, the memory of Naomi Carter returned once more, not as a disruption, not as a moment of conflict, but as a point of clarity, the instant where everything he thought he understood had been quietly challenged and reshaped. And he realized now that it was not the authority she held that had changed him. It was the way she carried it, without force, without display, without needing recognition. And that understanding stayed with him as he lowered his gaze briefly, looking at the asphalt beneath his feet, the same ground he had stood on all night, but now feeling different in a way he could not ignore. And one of the senior officers approached again, this time placing a hand lightly on Brooks's shoulder, a gesture of acknowledgement more than anything else. "Shift is almost over," he said. And Brooks nodded. "Yeah," he replied, his voice steady, and the officer gave a small nod before walking away, leaving Brooks alone once more with the road stretching out ahead. And as the final car of the morning wave passed through, the checkpoint began to quiet, the hum of engines fading into the distance, the lights above dimming as they were no longer needed. And Brooks took a slow breath, the air cool and clear, and for the first time since the night began, there was no urgency, no pressure, just a moment of stillness. And in that stillness, he understood something that would stay with him long after this shift ended. That authority is not defined by how quickly you act or how firmly you speak, but by how clearly you see. And as he stepped back from the lane, allowing the road to open fully again, the lesson remained, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, shaping the way he would stand, the way he would speak, the way he would see every person who crossed his path from this point forward. The checkpoint had almost fully transitioned into daylight operations, the artificial lights now dimmed to a faint glow against the growing brightness of the morning, and Officer Daniel Brooks stood near the edge of the lane as the final vehicles of the early rush passed through, their presence no longer urgent, no longer demanding, just part of the steady rhythm of a new day beginning. And for the first time since the night had started, there was space, not just physical space on the road, but mental space, a quiet openness that allowed everything that had happened to settle fully into place. And Brooks shifted his stance slightly, rolling his shoulders back as if releasing a weight he had not realized he was carrying. And his eyes moved once more down the stretch of road ahead, the same path Naomi Carter had taken hours earlier, now bathed in soft morning light, ordinary to anyone else, but to him, it marked the point where something fundamental had changed, and he did not replay the confrontation, not the commands, not the tension. Instead, he remembered the stillness, the certainty that had not required validation, the way her presence alone had redefined the situation without escalation, and that understanding lingered, shaping the way he now viewed not just that moment, but every moment that had followed. And as one of the last cars rolled through without stopping, waved on by another officer further down the lane, Brooks took a step back, his role in the checkpoint no longer active for the moment, and he glanced around at his colleagues, noticing the subtle shifts in them as well, the quieter tone of their voices, the more measured pace of their movements, as if the night had left its mark on more than just him. And one of the officers approached, holding a clipboard, running through standard end-of-shift checks. "Everything logged?" he asked, his tone routine. And Brooks nodded. "Yes," he replied, the words simple but grounded. And as the officer moved on, Brooks allowed himself a brief pause, looking down at his hands again, not with uncertainty this time, but with recognition, understanding the responsibility they carried in a way that felt clearer than before, and he flexed his fingers slightly, a small, almost unconscious movement, before letting them rest at his sides. And in that moment, the weight of authority felt different, not lighter, not heavier, but more precise, more defined by awareness than assumption. And he thought about the countless stops he had made before this night, the decisions formed in seconds, the judgments made without question, and he realized how easily those moments could have followed the same path, how easily he could have remained unaware of the gap between what he believed and what was real. And that realization did not come with regret, but with clarity, a quiet acknowledgement of what had been and what now needed to change. And as the last vehicle cleared the checkpoint, the road opened fully, stretching out into the distance without interruption, the cones still in place but no longer directing traffic, just marking the space where control had once been asserted. And Brooks stepped to the side, out of the lane entirely now, his role complete for the moment. And he took a slow breath, the air cool and steady, filling his lungs as the morning settled around him. And in that breath, there was no tension, no urgency, just presence, and he understood then that what had happened was not just a single moment of correction, not just a brief interruption in routine, but a shift that would carry forward into every future interaction, every decision, every word spoken. Because once you see beyond assumption, once you recognize the weight of truth over perception, there is no returning to the way things were, only moving forward with a clearer understanding. And as Brooks turned slightly, preparing to step away from the checkpoint and into the rest of his day, the road behind him remained quiet, but the lesson it had delivered continued to echo, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, shaping the path ahead in ways that would only become clearer with time. The road was fully open now, stretching forward under the soft glow of morning. No barriers, no pauses, no interruptions, just a clear path disappearing into the distance. And Officer Daniel Brooks stood at the edge of the checkpoint, no longer directing traffic, no longer holding up hands or issuing commands, just watching as the world moved forward without him. The hum of engines replaced by a quiet stillness that settled deep into the space where tension had once lived. And for the first time since the night began, there was nothing left to manage, nothing left to control, only the echo of what had happened and the understanding that followed. And he took a slow breath, letting it settle, not rushing to fill the silence, not reaching for the next task, just standing there as the morning unfolded around him, and his mind returned once more to Naomi Carter, not as a figure of authority, not as a title or a role, but as a presence, the calm certainty she carried, the way she never needed to raise her voice or prove her place, because it was already hers, whether anyone recognized it or not. And that was the moment that stayed with him, not the interruption, not the command to stand down, but the realization that power does not always announce itself, and truth does not need permission to exist. And as he looked down at the empty lane where her car had once been stopped, he understood something deeper now, something that reached beyond procedure and training, that every person who passes through a moment like that carries a story, a weight, a reality that is not always visible. And the danger lies not in what you see, but in what you assume you understand. And he had assumed, quickly, confidently, without question, and that assumption had almost placed him on the wrong side of something far greater than he could control. And yet the correction had not come with force, it had come with clarity, quiet and undeniable. And that was what changed him, because it showed him that real authority does not need to dominate, it simply needs to be recognized. And as the sun rose higher, casting light across the asphalt and dissolving the last traces of the night, Brooks stepped forward once more, not into position, not into control, but into a new understanding of the role he carried. And he knew that the next time he raised his hand to stop a vehicle, the next time he looked into someone's eyes across a window or a door, it would not be the same, because he would not be the same. The certainty would still be there, the training, the structure, the responsibility. But now it would be grounded in something deeper, something steadier, awareness. And as he turned away from the road, beginning to walk back toward the station behind him, the scene faded into routine once more, another shift completed, another morning beginning. But the lesson remained, quiet and constant, carried forward into every step that followed. Because in the end, he thought he was the one controlling the checkpoint. But that day, the checkpoint revealed something else entirely. That control without understanding is just noise, and real authority begins the moment you learn to see beyond it.